The retired samurai walked slowly along the winding stone path of the Edo garden, his geta sandals whispering against the damp moss that crept between the cobbles. Dawn mist clung to the air, cool and faintly sweet with the scent of pine needles and the distant tang of early blooming plum blossoms. The hem of his indigo kimono brushed the dewy grass, and though his hands once feared for their swift, lethal precision now rested empty at his sides, his fingers still curled faintly. As if remembering the hilt of his katana, a breeze stirred the maple leaves above, their edges tinged with the first gold of autumn. And in that soft rustling, he heard echoes. The distant clash of steel, the shuddering cries of battle, the hollow silence that always followed. Closing his eyes, he inhaled deeply, the bitterness of matcha still lingering on his tongue from his morning ritual, a fleeting counterpoint to the metallic aftertaste of memory. The garden pond lay still before him, its surface a perfect mirror of the pale sky, undisturbed except for the occasional ripple as a koi ghosted beneath. Kneeling at the water's edge, he watched his reflection fracture and reform, his weathered face the scar along his jaw, the lines etched by time seeming both familiar and strange. His breath slowed, matching the rhythm of the cricket's fading chorus. And as the first sunlight spilled over the stone lanterns, he felt the weight of his past settle like a sheathed blade across his lap. Here, among the raked gravel seas and the stoic pines, he sought what the battlefield had never offered: stillness. Yet serenity was not surrender. The discipline of his sword had become the discipline of his brush, the precise arc of ink on paper no less exacting than the cut of steel. He flexed his fingers once, dispelling the tremor that sometimes came uninvited, and reached for the small notebook tucked into his obi. A crane took flight from the reeds, its wings cutting the air with a sound like a banner unfurling. He paused, listening, waiting until the haiku found him, as inevitable as the turning of seasons, as quiet as the piece he had carved from the remnants of war. The retired samurai knelt beneath the cherry blossom tree, the petals drifting down like whispers of a life he once knew swift, fragile, and stained with the hues of memory. The air was crisp with the promise of spring, carrying the faintest hint of green tea from a nearby shop, mingling with the earthy dampness of freshly swept tatami mats in the temple behind him. His calloused fingers, once quick to tighten around the tsuka of his katana, now hovered above a sheet of washi paper, the brush trembling slightly not from fear, but from the weight of the unsaid. The scent of ink, dark and deliberate, reminded him of blood spilled in moonlight. The sharp, metallic tang that had clung to his hands, no matter how fiercely he scrubbed them in the river. He closed his eyes, and for a breath, the past threatened to surge. The scream of steel drawn from its saya, the way the wind stilled before a killing strike. But then a single petal landed on his wrist, delicate as a moth's wing, and he exhaled, slow and measured, as if releasing the ghosts that clung to his ribs. The cobbled street murmured with the rhythmic clatter of geta, a distant vendor's chant weaving through the rustling branches. He opened his eyes, focusing on the way the petals fell not in chaos, but in a dance ordained by seasons older than empires. The tree's gnarled bark, weathered like his own scars, bore witness to generations of fleeting beauty, of warriors and poets who had stood beneath its boughs, seeking solace or surrender. His brush touched the paper, the first stroke a deliberate curve like the arc of a blade, yet softer, yielding. In the space between heartbeats, he wrestled with the contradiction, the hands that had taken lives now seeking to cradle the ephemeral, to carve meaning into 17 syllables. The breeze shifted, carrying the temple's incense, sandalwood, and forgotten prayers, and with it, a line formed in his mind, clear as the ring of a bell. Petals like snowflakes, he wrote, the ink bleeding slightly, yet the sword's edge remembers. The final line lingered, suspended between regret and reverence, until he gave it voice. Spring condemns no one. Around him, the world continued a bee's hum, the distant laughter of children, but here, beneath the blossoms, time stretched thin, a single moment holding the weight of a lifetime. The samurai's shoulders eased, the tension unspooling like a torn banner in the wind. For now, the poem was enough. The war within could wait. The retired samurai knelt upon the tatami mat. Its faint, sun-warmed scent of straw and beeswax mingling with the brisk fragrance of freshly whisked matcha beside him. His hands moved with the same measured grace they had once wielded in battle, slow, deliberate, each motion a ritual. The ink stone, smooth as a river stone beneath his fingertips, held the weight of memory, the way his calloused palms had once gripped the hilt of his katana, the whisper-steel sigh of the blade sliding free from its saya. A sound so sharp it seemed to cut the silence before battle. Now, instead of a weapon, he cradled the brush, its bamboo shaft cool against his skin, the hairs soft as the first snowfall on the Kyushu foothills of his youth. He ground the ink stick in slow circles, watching the water darken like a storm rolling over the sea, his breath deepening as the rhythm settled into his bones. The past lingered in the tremor of his left hand, not from fear now, but from the echo of old wounds, phantom pains of strikes given and received. His fingertips brushed the mulberry paper, its surface like finely spun silk. And for a moment, he was back on the battlefield, the wind carrying the iron tang of blood and the distant cries of crows circling above the fallen. But here, in the quiet of his study, the only sound was the soft creak of cedar beams in the morning chill, the murmur of the hearth's embers, the distant clatter of geta sandals on the cobbled street, outside a rhythm as steady as his heartbeat. He exhaled, and his shoulders eased as the tension bled away. Ink met paper in a single, unbroken stroke, the character unfolding like a crane's wing in flight. This, too, was a kind of combat, each line a parry, each blank space a retreat, the balance of emptiness and form a duel fought not with steel, but with soul. The gods of poetry and war watched alike, though he sought now to honor not the chaos of battle, but the silence between heartbeats, the fleeting beauty of a maple leaf clinging to a branch before the autumn wind swept it away. The brush paused, hovering above the page as a shaft of dawn light spilled through the shoji screen, gilding the ink's wet sheen. In that stillness, he glimpsed it, the fragile, impermanent piece he had spent a lifetime chasing, not in the clash of swords, but in the discipline of creation, in the way the world held its breath just before beauty was born. The retired samurai knelt on the tatami mat, the dry, sweet scent of woven reeds rising softly around him, mingling with the faint bitterness of freshly whisked matcha. The morning light spilled through the shoji screen, painting translucent gold across the polished wood floor, where his inkstone rested beside a single sheet of handmade paper. His calloused fingers, once swift to tighten around a sword hilt, now cradled the brush with deliberate care. Yet, as he dipped it into the ink, the rhythm of his breath faltered. The scrape of bristle against stone echoed like the sharp, discordant whisper of a katana drawn from its saya, a sound his body remembered before his mind could dismiss it. The memory rose unbidden, the iron stench of blood thickening the air, the sticky warmth on his hands, the distant screams swallowed by twilight fog. His hand trembled, and a single drop of ink bloomed on the paper like a bruise. He closed his eyes, but the battlefield unfolded behind his lid's faces of fallen foes, their last gasps harmonizing with the wind through dead grass. The weight of his armor, long since traded for light cotton robes, pressed upon his shoulders anew. Outside, a sparrow chirped a fragile living thing, yet even its song seemed to sharpen into the war cries of men. He exhaled, slow and uneven, the steam from his tea curling like smoke from long-extinguished watchfires. The brush hovered between past and present, the ink threatening to bleed into another confession of violence. But then, the wind shifted. The fragrance of plum blossoms slipped through the screen, delicate as a pardon. Somewhere beyond the garden, wooden geta clattered against cobblestones, a cadence softer than hoofbeats, softer than marching feet. His fingers relaxed. The past was a ghost, but the paper before him was real, the ink still wet. He pressed the brush down, committing to the first stroke. The haiku would not erase the wars he had waged, but here, in the stillness between breaths, he could compose a different kind of mercy. Each character emerged measured, imperfect like footsteps leading away from a grave. The retired samurai set aside his brush with deliberate slowness, his calloused fingers lingering on the smooth shaft of bamboo before releasing it, the bristles still glistening with ink. The faint scent of wet pigment mingled with the clean, sun-warmed straw of the tatami beneath him. The faintest trace of cedar from the low writing desk, grounding him in the present. Outside, the wind whispered through the maple leaves, their edges just beginning to blush with autumn's fire, a sound so delicate it seemed to echo the silent slide of a katana drawn from its saya. The moment before steel met flesh, he closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, as if to rid his lungs of the old dust of battlefields, the iron tang of blood that still clung to his dreams. The bitter aftertaste of matcha lingered on his tongue, its astringency, a familiar anchor, a contrast to the phantom sweetness of sake shared with long-dead comrades. His hands, once swift and sure in violence, now rested palms, up on his knees, the faint tremor in his left thumb betraying the tension coiled beneath his stillness. Memories flickered the weight of armor in the rain, the choked cries of men fallen to his blade, the way the dawn would sometimes gild the carnage with a cruel, beautiful light. He focused on the cool silk of his kimono against his wrists, the rhythmic tap-tap of a neighbor's guitar on the cobbled path outside, the distant chime of temple bells marking time's relentless flow. Each breath deepened, pulling him further from the past, each exhale a surrender to the now. The late afternoon light shifted, painting the shoji screens with gold, and for a heartbeat, he saw not the ghosts of war, but the way the same light once touched the mist over his mother's garden, the dewdrops on spiderwebs like 1,000 unsung haiku. The brush lay dormant, but in his mind, the words still swirled images of cranes in flight, of moonlit rivers, of the eternal dialogue between wind and willow. Here, in the quiet communion of ink and air, he sought not mastery over others, but over the storm within, the relentless tide of memory yielding at last to the discipline of peace. The gods, if they watched, would see not a warrior, but a man kneeling at the altar of stillness, his heartbeat slowing to match the earth's own quiet pulse. The retired samurai knelt upon the tatami mat, its crisp, woven scent mingling with the faint earthiness of damp paper as he unrolled a fresh sheet before him. The morning light, soft as brushed silk, slanted through the shoji screen, casting delicate shadows that trembled with the passage of a distant breeze. His fingers, once calloused from the grip of a katana, now traced the smooth grain of the low writing desk. The polished would cool beneath his touch, a stark contrast to the memory of warm blood on steel. He exhaled slowly, the bitterness of matcha still lingering on his tongue, its astringency a familiar companion to his meditations. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of guitar on cobblestones echoed like the distant drumbeats of a marching army, a sound that once quickened his pulse, but now only deepened the stillness within. Yet, as he dipped his brush into the inkstone, the black pool rippling like a moonlit river, his hand hesitated. The cherry blossoms outside had stirred him their fleeting beauty, their silent fall, but the haiku he had begun felt hollow, mere words chasing the ghost of an emotion he could not name. The brush hovered, a tremor flickering through his wrist, not from age but from the weight of the unsaid. He had written of petals, of spring, yet the true verse lay buried beneath the scars of battles long past, where the clash of swords had once been his poetry. He closed his eyes, the sharp, almost imperceptible whisper of a blade drawn in memory humming in his ears, a sound as precise as the cut of a master's strike. The cherry blossoms, like the lives he had taken, were transient, but where their fall was gentle, his past was not. His breath caught a pause between heartbeats, and in that silence, he sought the depth he craved, the harmony between the warrior who had lived by the sword and the man who now sought to weave peace into ink. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of blossoms and the distant murmur of a temple bell, its tone resonating like the voice of the divine, reminding him that even the gods had known both fury and grace. Slowly he lowered the brush, the characters flowing now not from thought, but from the quiet place where his soul met the universe. The haiku, when finished, would bear no trace of blood, yet it would hold the weight of every drop spilled, every life honored, every dawn witnessed a fleeting blossom, a perfect strike, a single breath held in the space between war and peace. The morning light filtered through the shoji screens, pale and delicate as the steamed rice paper upon which he wrote. The retired samurai knelt on the tatami mat, its woven reeds releasing a faint, clean scent beneath him, a scent that always carried the ghost of memory, of countless mornings spent in stillness before battle. The grinding of ink against stone filled the quiet room, a rhythmic whisper counterbalanced by the distant call of a temple bell. His hands, once swift with the lethal certainty of a blade, now moved deliberately, trembling slightly as they hovered above the blank page. The air was cool, carrying the faintest tang of green tea from the chowan beside him, its bitterness lingering on his tongue like the aftertaste of old regrets. He inhaled deeply, the breath shuddering just slightly, not from frailty, but from the weight of the past, the countless lives his sword had claimed echoing in the silence between heartbeats. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobbled streets told of merchants beginning their day, each wooden step a testament to the nation's quiet resilience, rebuilding itself after war as he sought to rebuild himself. The paper before him was smooth beneath his fingertips, its surface untouched, pristine, yet it intimidated him more than any battlefield ever had. Haiku demanded not force, but surrender, not domination, but harmony. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the morning sun brush his face, recalling the sharp, metallic whisper of his katana being drawn, how its weight had felt like an extension of his soul. Now the blade rested in its scabbard, sullying no peace, its presence a shadow he no longer feared nor worshipped. A sparrow alighted on the Engawa ledge, its tiny claws scraping softly against the polished wood. His gaze followed it, tracing the effortless arc of its flight as it vanished into the sakura branches, petals trembling in its wake. The moment was fleeting, perfect, a whisper of nature's endless cycle. He exhaled, fingers tightening around the brush, and at last pressed ink to paper. The first stroke was uncertain, bleeding slightly into the fibers, but the second gained resolve. The third flowed like a river finding its course. Each character was a meditation, a stripping away of ego, of violence, of noise. He worked in silence, lips moving soundlessly as he weighed each syllable against 17 beats, shaping them like a gardener tending bonsai, pruning until only essence remained. The scent of fresh ink mingled with the tea's earthy aroma, and for a moment, he was no longer a retired warrior, but a student again, humbled, reborn. The poem formed slowly, a distillation of the morning's quiet grace, the sparrow's flight, the bell's distant toll, the faint tremor in his hands as they coaxed beauty from emptiness. When he finished, he hesitated, then added his seal with a quiet press, not the crimson smear of battle, but the deliberate mark of a man who had chosen a different mastery. The poem was imperfect, but so was he. And in that imperfection lay the truth he sought, that serenity was not the absence of war, but the courage to lay down the sword and take up the brush instead. The morning air carried the crisp scent of freshly woven tatami mingled with the faint, earthy bitterness of matcha, steam curling from the bowl in delicate tendrils that vanished like whispers. The retired samurai, his hands once feared for their lethal precision, now cradled the ceramic with deliberate care, fingertips tracing its imperfections, as if memorizing its shape. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobbled streets echoed like a muted heartbeat, a reminder of the world moving on while he sought stillness. The tatami beneath him bore the faintest indentation from years of seated meditation, a testament to his newfound discipline. Yet his spine remained rigid, as though the ghost of his armor still clung to him. A breeze stirred the shoji screen, casting dappled light across the inkstone beside him, its surface smooth as a river stone beneath his calloused thumb. He exhaled slowly, willing his mind to empty, but the memories surfaced unbidden, the metallic tang of blood on winter air, the sharp, almost imperceptible shink of his katana leaving its sheath, a sound so familiar it had once been the prelude to both his prowess and his shame. Now the blade rested in its stand, its polished edge catching the light like a silent accusation. Could a lifetime of violence truly be washed away by the beauty of 17 syllables? The question coiled in his chest, tightening with each breath. Then, the soft rustle of silk announced a presence, a fellow poet, his steps light yet deliberate, pausing at the threshold. The man's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, lingered on the unfinished haiku beside the samurai, its characters stark and spare. "Your words are precise," he murmured, "like the cut of a blade. But where is the wound they seek to heal?" The critique hung in the air, sharper than any sword's edge. The samurai's fingers tensed imperceptibly around his brush, a tremor betraying the storm beneath his calm. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, the steam from the tea frozen mid-curl. The distant cry of a crow muffled, as if the gods themselves leaned in to listen. The poet's words had struck a chord deeper than any battle scar, unraveling the fragile piece he'd woven from discipline and ink. Could he confront the shadows that clung to his soul like old bloodstains, or would he retreat into the safety of empty perfection? Outside, a single cherry blossom drifted past the window, its fall as inevitable as the passage of time. The samurai closed his eyes, inhaled the scent of pine resin and paper, and reached for his brush again. This time, his hand did not shake. The tatami exhaled its clean, sun-warmed scent as the old samurai knelt beside the low table. The polished wood cool beneath his trembling fingers. Outside, the first cherry blossoms of spring trembled in the breeze, their fragile petals brushing against the shoji screen with a sound like distant whispers. He reached for the worn sheaf of papers, his haikus from years past, and as he lifted them, the edge of one sheet caught on the callus of his thumb, a roughness forged by decades gripping a katana, that same imperceptible rasp echoing the moment before steel left its scabbard. The words stared back at him, stark as blood on snow. Battle cries fade, yet the scent of burning fields clings to my sleeves. His breath hitched, the bitter green tea on his tongue suddenly tasting of ash and memory. He remembered the way the smoke had coiled above the villages he'd crossed, how the weight of his armor had pressed him into the earth like a penitent before a wrathful god. Back then, his verses had been blades, sharp and unforgiving, each syllable slicing open the wounds he dared not name. Now, the paper trembled not from the tremor in his hands, but from the quiet horror of recognition. Had he truly been so consumed? A bead of condensation slid down the teacup, tracing a path like a tear, and he followed it with his eyes, grounding himself in the present. The rhythmic clatter of geta sandals on cobbled streets drifted through the open window, the sound orderly, predictable, a far cry from the chaotic clash of battle. He closed his eyes, inhaling the faint citrus tang of yuzu from the garden, and slowly exhaled the past. When he looked again, his gaze settled on a newer poem, written just that morning. Frost on the bridge, the heron's reflection unbroken by stone. His thumb smoothed the page, lingering over the characters, their strokes steady now, deliberate. Where once there had been fury, there was space between the letters, between his breaths. The heron did not fight the water, it moved with it, became part of it. Was this not the lesson the monks had tried to teach him? The sword could sever life, but only stillness could reveal its shape. A shadow passed over the page as a cloud drifted across the sun, and for a heartbeat, the room darkened, the air thickening like the moment before a storm. His pulse quickened, an old instinct, the body remembering what the mind wished to forget. But then the light returned, golden and forgiving, painting the silk of his kimono in hues of honey and wheat. He touched the fabric, its smoothness a silent testament to the hands that had woven it, to the seasons of mulberry and worm, to the patience required to create something so unassuming, so strong. His own hands had built nothing then, they had only unmade. Now they cradled poetry like an offering, each word a seed planted in the fertile dark of the page. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain from distant mountains, and he smiled. Growth was slow. Roots did not argue with the earth. They pressed against it, trusted it. He folded the old haikus away, their corners aligning with the precision of a swordsman's final bow. The past would always be there, coiled in the ink, in the scars, but the poem he would write tomorrow. It would begin with the sound of rain, and the way the world softened beneath it. The retired samurai knelt upon the tatami mat, its clean, sun-warmed scent mingling with the earthy bitterness of freshly whisked matcha. The morning light slanted through the shoji screen, dust motes swirling like memories of distant battlefields. His calloused fingers, once swift to unsheathe a blade with that sharp, deadly whisper of steel against lacquered wood, now hovered above the parchment, trembling slightly not with age, but with the weight of unshed words. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of geta on cobblestones echoed the march of time, each step a reminder of the life he had left behind, the blood staining his soul like ink on rice paper. He closed his eyes, drawing in a slow breath, the air cool and fragrant with pine from the garden, and exhaled the ghosts of war. In the stillness, his mind wandered. The screams of men, the metallic tang of blood, the way the moon had hung indifferent over burning villages. Now he sought refuge in the discipline of syllables, the quiet mastery of 17 sounds arranged just so. The brush dipped into ink, black as a moonless night, and he hesitated not from doubt, but from the profound understanding that each stroke was a suture, stitching the violence of his past to the serenity he now cultivated. The first character bloomed beneath his hand, its curves deliberate as a swordsman's parry, its edges softened like the worn hilt of his katana, now sheathed forever. The scent of damp paper rose, mingling with the faint incense of cedar from the low table, and he felt the old itch in his palm, the muscle memory of a strike long withheld. But here, in this small ritual, there was no enemy to slay, only the relentless pursuit of beauty, each line a prayer to the gods of balance, to the turn of seasons that forgave no one, yet demanded nothing. The second line flowed, a whisper of wind through bamboo, a fleeting image of cherry blossom's softness forged from hardness, like the way his heart had learned to beat again after years of silence. The afternoon deepened, the light shifting golden across the polished wood. And as he inscribed the final stroke, he marveled at how the ink held both his fury and his peace, how the paper bore them equally. The haiku was finished, yet incomplete, like the man who had written it forever caught between the shadow of the sword and the light of the brush, between the roar of battle and the hush of dawn. But for now, that was enough. He lifted the cup of tea, its warmth seeping into his palms, and drank, the bitterness a comfort, a reminder that even in stillness he was alive. The soft rustle of rice paper beneath his calloused fingers was a whisper compared to the remembered screams of battle. Yet, Kensuke found himself leaning into its quietude like a drowning man, grasping driftwood. The tatami beneath his knees released the faint, sun-warmed scent of straw clean, and simple as he adjusted his posture, the motion sending a dull ache through the old wound in his thigh. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the bamboo grove, its hollow clatter a counterpoint to the deliberate scrape of his brush against inkstone. Each deliberate stroke carried the weight of surrender, not to an enemy's blade, but to the trembling in his own hands that had once drawn a katana with lethal precision, now pausing midair, as if expecting blood to drip from the brush instead of ink. The bitterness of matcha lingered on his tongue, its earthy sharpness a mirror to the memories that rose unbidden. The coppery stench of battlefield mud, the way dawn light had glinted off broken armor like accusing eyes. He exhaled, long and slow, watching his breath disturb the pale steam curling from his teacup, a temporary disturbance, like the ghosts he tried to outrun. The haiku emerged in fragments, syllables pared down like a warrior's kit before a pilgrimage. Fallen leaves circling his knuckles whitened around the brush. How many souls had he seen cut down mid-motion, their lives as brief as cherry blossoms? The rhythmic clack-clack of a neighbor's guitar on cobblestones anchored him to the present, to the way afternoon light pooled like spilled sake on the polished cedar floor. Ink bloomed across the page. The crane's wings unfold. His chest tightened. He'd seen cranes on the riverbank yesterday, their elegance a silent rebuke to the crude efficiency of his swordwork. Was it sacrilege for a man like him to borrow their grace for poetry? The brush hovered, trembling. Then, as if guided by the kami themselves, the final line flowed forth. One breath, one stroke, one sky. Something unraveled in him, then not the jagged rupture of a wound reopening, but the quiet release of a suture dissolving. The characters stood stark and perfect, their balance echoing the equilibrium he sought in meditation, where even the weight of his sins could be held lightly, like a maple leaf balanced on still water. Outside, the wind stilled. A single leaf tapped against the shoji screen, its shadow dancing like a phantom across his unfinished verse. Kensuke set down the brush, running a thumb along its smooth bamboo shaft the same way he'd once checked his sword for nicks. The ink shimmered wetly, a tiny universe of black stars swelling into the paper's fibers. For the first time in years, the silence between his heartbeats felt vast enough to hold both the man he'd been and the man he was becoming. The tea had gone cold, but its aftertaste was sweet. The scent of freshly woven tatami mats mingled with the steam of bitter green tea. A crispness in the air that carried the faintest hint of cherry blossoms from the garden beyond the shoji screens. The retired samurai knelt in silence, his hands resting on his thighs, fingertips tracing the coarse weave of his robe once armor-lined, now softened by time. The weight of his past lingered in the calluses of his palms, in the way his breath still hitched when he heard the distant, almost imperceptible slide of a blade from its sheath, a sound like wind through dead reeds. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the brush, the ink-darkened tip hovering above the paper, poised between violence and creation. He exhaled, slow and deliberate, feeling the tension in his shoulders unravel like the frayed edges of an old battle standard. The haiku before him was simple spring blossoms, a wandering breeze, yet the words coiled deeper, mirroring his own restless spirit. His mind wandered to the clamor of battlefield dawns, the metallic tang of blood on his tongue, the way the earth shook beneath charging horses. But here, now, there was only the whisper of silk against wood as he adjusted his posture, the rhythmic clatter of guitar on cobbled streets outside, a reminder of life's unbroken flow. The brush touched paper, ink blooming like shadows at dusk. Each stroke was a surrender, a shedding of the warrior's pride, as if the gods themselves watched through the swaying branches of the cherry tree outside. The blossoms would fall, as all things did soldiers, empires, the sharp edge of regret. But in this moment, there was only the stillness, the scent of tea cooling, the faint warmth of sunlight slipping through the screen like a forgiven sin. The haiku was no longer about petals adrift on water. It was about the quiet alchemy of turning swords into brushes, blood into ink, and in that transformation, finding a peace as delicate and enduring as the first light of dawn. Under the soft glow of paper lanterns, the retired samurai knelt upon the tatami mat, its woven reeds exhaling the faint, clean scent of sun-dried straw, a fragrance intertwined with memories of dojos and quiet mornings before battle. His inkstone, smooth as a river pebble, held a pool of midnight black sumi, its surface mirroring the flicker of candlelight like the still waters of a shrine pond. The brush, poised between his calloused fingers, trembled not from age, but from the weight of the unsaid. The past clung to him, the scream of steel drawn from its saya, that sharp, lethal whisper he had known too well, the copper tang of blood on winter air, the tremble of the earth beneath charging feet. Yet here, in this hushed room, the only sound was the whisper of bristles kissing paper, each stroke a surrender. The characters unfolded K's no Kokoro, heart of the wind. He exhaled, long and slow, as if expelling the last remnants of battlefield smoke from his lungs. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of guitar on cobblestones echoed like a distant drum, a reminder of the world moving on, oblivious to his quiet reckoning. The steam from his tea curled upward, carrying the bitter green scent of matcha, a ritual as deliberate as the cleaning of a blade. His knuckles whitened around the cup, the heat seeping into his skin, grounding him. He wondered if the gods watched him now, this man who once carved fate with a katana now shaping it with ink. Was this peace, or merely another battlefield? The fragility of the paper beneath his palm mocked the armor he once wore. Poetry demanded more courage than combat. To lay bare the soul required a different kind of strength. The lantern's glow shifted as a breeze slipped through the shoji screen. And in that dance of light and shadow, he saw the cherry blossoms of his youth, their petals falling like the lives he had taken swift, inevitable, beautiful in their transience. His brush hovered, one more line. The syllables coiled tight in his chest, a secret even the moonlight couldn't pry loose. The ink bled into the page Shizukesa nai Akairu, falling into silence. A shudder ran through him, not of sorrow, but release. The poem was complete, a fragile bridge between the man he had been and the man he prayed to become. Beyond the window, the wind stirred the bamboo grove, its hollow clatter a chorus of approval or perhaps forgiveness. He closed his eyes and let the stillness claim him, the past and the present folding into the quiet rhythm of his breath. The sword had brought him power, but the brush, at last, had brought him home. The dawn air carries the faint, clean scent of fresh tatami, and the earthy bitterness of matcha, steam curling from the chowan like a whispered prayer. The retired samurai kneels by the low writing desk, his calloused hands that once gripped a katana with lethal precision, now cradle a brush with deliberate grace. The room is hushed, save for the distant, rhythmic clatter of geta on cobbled streets and the almost imperceptible scrape of ink stick against suzuri. A sound as sharp, yet fleeting as the memory of drawn steel. He exhales slowly, the breath stirring the delicate silk of his sleeves, and for a moment, the past flickers behind his closed eyelids. The screams of battle, the coppery tang of blood, the weight of a life taken with a single, flawless strike. His fingers tremble, not with age, but with the echo of that violence, the ghost of the warrior he once was. Yet here, now, there is only the smooth, cool grain of the paper beneath his palm, the faint resistance of the brush as it touches the page, bleeding ink like shadow into light. The first character forms steady, unadorned, a single stroke that carries the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. Outside, a sparrow alights on the garden's moss-cushioned stone, its chirp a fleeting note in the symphony of morning. He glimpses it, and for a heartbeat, the world narrows to that small, fragile life, its brevity a mirror of his own. The second character curves, deliberate as the moon's path across the night sky, a balance to the first. His chest tightens, the old ghosts stir, whispering of chaos, of bloodied hands that will never truly be clean. But then the brush pauses, hovers. The ink pools, dark as regret, until he breathes again, and the rhythm returns. The final stroke is not an ending, but a surrender. A release as quiet as autumn leaves drifting to the earth. The haiku rests before him, 17 syllables etched in stark simplicity, a bridge between the man who wielded death and the man who now seeks the sacred in the ordinary. The characters seem to pulse with a life of their own, each line a step on the path towards something unnameable, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps peace. The steam from his tea has faded. The room is warmer now, golden with creeping sunlight. He lifts the chowan, the ceramic ruff against his lips, the tea's bitterness a sacrament. Somewhere beyond the shoji, the wind stirs the cherry blossoms, their petals scattering like fragments of old vows. He closes his eyes. The poem is finished. The war is not. But in this fragile, fleeting moment, that is enough. The retired samurai knelt on the tatami. The clean, sun-warmed scent of woven straw mingling with the subtle bitterness of freshly whisked matcha. The parchment before him, smooth beneath his calloused fingers, bore 17 syllables, his latest haiku inked in strokes, as deliberate as those of his sword once were. He inhaled, feeling the tremor in his breath, that lingering echo of his past self. The warrior who had drawn his katana with a sound like winter wind splitting bamboo. The silence of the tea room deepened around him, broken only by the distant, rhythmic clatter of wooden geta on cobbled streets, a reminder of the world moving on beyond the stillness he cultivated. As he read the poem aloud, his voice was low, each syllable measured, as if weighed against the countless lives he had taken. The words seemed to hover in the air, delicate yet unbreakable, like cherry blossom petals riding a river's current. He paused, noticing the way the late afternoon light slanted through the shoji screens, casting trembling shadows that danced like ghosts of battles long past. The taste of the tea lingered on his tongue, bitter yet cleansing, akin to the clarity that came after bloodshed. Though now there was no blood, only ink and breath. His hands, once steady in violence, now trembled slightly as they traced the edge of the parchment, a faint memory of the grip that had once ruled the battlefield. He closed his eyes, hearing the whispering rustle of the maple outside, leaves brushing against each other like the distant clash of swords, a sound both familiar and foreign. The poem spoke of autumn's dusk, of surrendering to the earth, and in its simplicity, he felt the weight of his years soften. Here, in this quietude, he was no longer a storm but the stillness after, no longer the blade but the hand that laid it down. The haiku was a bridge between who he had been and who he had become, a testament to the discipline that had once fueled his violence, now honed into the pursuit of something unbreakably serene. Outside, the first evening bell tolled, its resonance echoing through the village like a whispered prayer. And for a moment, he could almost believe the gods themselves were listening. The soft rustle of silk against tatami mats filled the hushed room as the retired samurai knelt. The clean scent of freshly woven reeds mingling with the earthy aroma of steaming green tea. Outside, the evening air carried the faintest hint of cherry blossoms, a whisper of spring's ephemeral beauty. His hands, once calloused from the grip of a katana, hands that had known the slick warmth of blood and the cold weight of duty, now trembled slightly as they unfolded the slip of paper bearing his haiku. The room held its breath, the only sound the distant clatter of geta on cobbled streets, a rhythmic echo of the life he had once marched through with lethal purpose. He inhaled slowly, the bitterness of the tea still lingering on his tongue. Its astringency, a quiet companion to the sharper memories that flickered at the edges of his mind. The metallic tang of battle, the deafening silence before the first clash of blades, the way the moon had watched, indifferent, as men fell. Now, the same moon spilled pale light through the shoji screens, painting the poets' faces in silver and shadow, their stillness a reverence he had never known on the battlefield. He began to speak, each syllable measured, a strike as deliberate as any sword cut, yet softer, shaped not to sever but to suture. His words unfolded like the petals of a chrysanthemum, slow, deliberate, yielding to the weight of the world, and yet unbroken. The pause between lines stretched like the space between heartbeats, a silence dense with the unspoken. The tension between the warrior who had mastered death and the poet who now sought to cradle life. In that moment, he felt the ghost of his younger self, the one who had believed strength lay only in the edge of a blade, stir uneasily. But here, in the quiet admiration of these artists, he glimpsed another kind of mastery, one that did not conquer, but harmonized. The paper trembled again, not from fear, but from the weight of memory meeting purpose. Outside, a breeze stirred the cherry branches, scattering petals like unanswered questions. And as the last line left his lips, the room remained silent, not in judgment, but in unity, as if the poets and the ghosts of his past had all leaned in, listening not to a warrior, but to a man who had learned at last to kneel before beauty. The tea cooled in its cup, the steam dissipating like the aftermath of a storm. And for the first time in years, he felt the deep, unshakable serenity of a river finding its course not by force, but by flow. The morning sun, pale gold and delicate as a butterfly's wing, slanted through the shoji screen, casting trembling lines of light across the tatami mats, their clean, grassy scent mingling with the faint musk of aged paper and the sharp, green bite of freshly whisked matcha. Kensuke knelt, his calloused hands resting on his thighs, fingers still remembering the grip of a sword. The way the wrappings had creaked under his palm in the heartbeat before a killing stroke. Now his fingers curled instead around a brush, its bamboo stem cool and smooth, the hairs whispering against parchment like a sigh. The village elders praised his haiku, their voices warm with admiration, but their words slipped past him like petals borne away on a stream. What stirred him was the moment when the characters flowed unbidden from his soul to the page, when the 17 syllables became a bridge between the chaos he had known and the stillness he sought. The kettle hissed on the hearth, steam curling like phantom banners from some long-forgotten battle, and he let the sound dissolve into the hush of the room, into the quiet rhythm of his breath. Outside, the wind tugged at the cherry blossoms, their petals falling in slow, weightless arcs mirroring the way his past sometimes descended upon him. The metallic scent of blood on rain-drenched earth, the the choked cry of an enemy whose face he never saw, the terrible weight of armor soaked through with sweat and fear. He closed his eyes, feeling the tremor in his left hand, the old wound from Mikitagahara, a ghost that would never quite leave him. Beside him, the katana lay sheathed in shadow, its edge still sharp enough to split a falling leaf. Yet now it was the sharpness of his mind he honed, the precision of each stroke of ink, each measured breath. The tea, bitter and bright on his tongue, grounded him, just as the discipline of the way of the sword once had. He dipped the brush again, watching as the ink bloomed across the paper like a distant landscape emerging from mist. 3 lines, a universe contained. The clatter of geta on cobblestones echoed from the street below. Footsteps, syncopated yet harmonious, a reminder of the world turning beyond his quiet refuge. In this space between breaths, between the remembered clash of steel and the fragile beauty of a single dew-glazed spiderweb, he found it. Not absolution, but a fleeting communion with something greater, the gods who shaped mountains and men, the eternal cycle of bloom and decay, the truth that even a life steeped in violence could, in the end, coax forth something tender. And when the poem stood complete, imperfect and alive, he set the brush down, exhaled, and let the peace of it settle into his bones, as deep and quiet as the roots of the ancient pine outside his window. As night draped its indigo veil over the quiet garden, the retired samurai knelt upon the tatami mat. The clean, woody scent of freshly woven reeds mingling with the earthy aroma of damp soil. The air was cool, carrying the faintest whisper of autumn, a hint of decaying leaves, a promise of transience. Beside him, a single sheet of handmade paper bore the ink-black strokes of his latest haiku, placed with deliberate care next to the chowan of steaming green tea, its bitterness lingering on his tongue like an unresolved thought. The smooth, polished wood of the low table beneath his fingertips was worn by time, much like his own hands, once calloused from the grip of a katana, now stained with ink. A breeze stirred, and the faint chime of wind bells left by his late wife sang from the eaves, a sound as sharp, yet fleeting as the memory of drawn steel. He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, feeling the weight of his breath, the rise and fall of his chest, as steady as the tides that had once carried warships to distant shores. The garden around him was a tableau of quiet movement. The rustle of bamboo, the occasional plop of a koi breaking the surface of the pond, its ripples catching the moonlight like scattered coins. In his mind's eye, he still saw the battlefield, the crimson spray of sunrise on steel, the screams swallowed by the drumbeat of hooves. But here, now, there was only the shudder of a moth's wings against the lantern's glow, the deliberate pause of his brush hovering above untouched paper. His hand trembled, not from age, but from the tension between the man he had been and the man he wished to become. The haiku before him was unfinished, a silent plea for harmony, yet the words eluded him like the elusive peace he sought. He inhaled again, tasting the iron-sharp tang of memory, the ghost of blood long washed from his hands. The tea had cooled, the steam had vanished. Time, unforgiving, had slipped past. Yet in this stillness, he felt the echo of something older, the murmurs of monks in temple halls, the rustling of cherry blossoms surrendering to the wind, the unbroken line of poets who had knelt as he did now, seeking in 17 syllables what swords could never grant. The moon, pale and watchful, cast his shadow against the shoji screen, a silhouette both frail and resolute. He picked up the brush, its bristles poised like a weapon sheathed in ink, and with a breath as deep as the ocean's sigh, he let the words come not as a battle cry, but as an offering. The first stroke was steady, the second lighter, the third a surrender. In the space between them he found not victory nor defeat, but the fragile, enduring balance of a life unburdened. The night deepened. Somewhere a distant temple bell tolled, its voice carrying across the centuries, a reminder that even warriors must someday lay down their blades and listen. The evening air carried the crisp scent of pine through the open shoji screens, mingling with the faint, clean aroma of tatami beneath him, a scent that always reminded him of stillness, of order. The retired samurai knelt in quiet reverence, his calloused hands resting on his thighs, fingers brushing against the smooth silk of his hakama. Shadows stretched long across the floor as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the room in hues of amber and indigo. And the only sound was the distant, rhythmic clatter of geta on cobbled streets, fading as the village settled into dusk. Before him, a single sheet of paper lay untouched, its surface almost luminous in the fading light, waiting for the ink's decisive kiss. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the days labor the careful pruning of his bonsai, the measured strokes of his brush as he penned a haiku about the first autumn leaf falling settle into his bones like a long-awaited sigh. It was a piece he had not known in decades, this quiet mastery of small, beautiful things. Yet, beneath it, like the faintest whisper of a drawn katana, a sound he would recognize even in sleep lingered the ghosts of his past. His breath hitched, just for a moment, as memory surfaced. The metallic tang of blood in the air, the screams swallowed by the thunder of hooves, the way his sword had felt like an extension of his very soul, both terrible and alive. He closed his eyes, letting the recollection pass like a storm cloud over the moon. The bitterness of his morning tea still clung to his tongue, a grounding reminder of the present, of the life he had chosen since laying down his blade. His fingers, once so steady in battle, trembled slightly as he reached for the brush, the tremor not from fear, but from the awful, exquisite tension between who he had been and who he was becoming. The gods themselves must have known this struggle. He thought the way even the mightiest river must etch its path stone by stone. As ink met paper, each character flowing from his hand like a prayer, he felt it again, that elusive serenity, not the absence of conflict, but the harmony within it. The crickets began their evening song, the wind rustling the bamboo outside as if in answer. And for the first time in years, the warrior within him did not stir. He was, at last, simply a man, breathing in the turning of the world. The retired samurai lay upon the tatami mat, its crisp, grassy scent mingling with the faint bitterness of freshly whisked matcha lingering on his tongue. The evening air, cool and still, carried the distant whisper of wind through bamboo, a rhythmic hush that seemed to slow the very passage of time. He exhaled, shoulders settling into the floor as if sinking into the earth itself. And for a moment, the weight of his years, the iron tang of blood on his hands, the shudder of a dying breath against his cheek rose like a specter in the darkness behind his eyelids. But then the scent of incense, thin and woody, coiled through the room, and he focused on the press of his spine against the mat, the deliberate stillness of his limbs, as he had done 1,000 times before the shrine or the battlefield. His fingers, once calloused from the grip of a sword, now traced the smooth ridge of a writing brush in his mind, recalling the morning's haiku, a fleeting image of cherry petals dissolving into river current. The poem had come reluctantly, pared down to 17 syllables after hours of grinding ink, each stroke of the brush a surrender to the discipline that had once guided his blade. Outside, a nightingale's cry pierced the silence, sharp as the sound of a katana drawn in twilight, and his breath hitched not in alarm, but in recognition. The past and present were not enemies, but two faces of the same moon. The hands that had taken lives now cradled the fragile beauty of a dew-laden spiderweb. The heart that had known fury now measured its beats in the space between heartbeats. He let the stillness fill him, the way dawn fills an empty cup. The gods, if they watched, would see no contradiction in this. A warrior's body at rest, a poet's soul alight. Sleep came not as an escape, but as the final verse of the day's unspoken poem, each breath a quiet homage to the mastery of surrender.